As I said, this all comes down to how you interpret this pair of sentences in the Constitution, these word salad sentences. The second one is easier to understand. The first has a whole lot of run-ons. Can you help me understand in plain English what those sentences mean from your reading of it?
Yeah, it's really simple. If you've taken an oath to support, protect, defend the Constitution, and then you engage in insurrection and rebellion, you can't serve in office again unless Congress, by 2/3 vote, allows you to. That's the rule. It's super simple. And the context here is really important. After the Civil War, there were not large-scale prosecutions of Confederate soldiers, Confederate politicians. In fact, by the end of 1868, President Johnson pardoned former Confederates. But there was a huge concern that they were still popular in the South, that if you allowed Confederates to run for office, they would run the place, that you would have the insurrectionists back in charge. And this was one measure taken to try to limit the influence, particularly of the Confederate elite on the South. And now here's what's really important about this. When the amendment was written, they did not limit the applicability of the amendment to the Confederacy only. They chose not to do that because there had been previous rebellions in American history. The Whiskey Rebellion, for example, is another example of a rebellion. So they included the broader language intentionally to capture future situations as well as what had just happened. And so that's really important for people to understand.
So that is important because one of the arguments I hear against this idea that Donald Trump participated in insurrection and that insurrection really means this amendment really applies to a Civil War style insurrection is that these two things are radically different. What happened on January 6th is nowhere close to what happened after the Civil War. And because this amendment was put into place, ratified after the Civil War, it's got to be of that scale. You're saying the people who wrote this would have known that in order to make it about the Civil War, they would have put it in writing. Confederates can't hold office.
Exactly. This language was intentionally crafted to include the broader concept of insurrection or rebellion. And there's been a lot of interesting work done by conservative originalist scholars to show that the definition of insurrection or rebellion is easily broad enough to encompass what happened on January 6th, because the definition of insurrection or rebellion is usually a violent attempt to alter, disrupt government policy or government action. And so, in other words, you're directly taking on the government in a rebellion. And this is exactly what happened on January 6th. It was a violent attack on the seat of government for the purpose, by the way, of changing the government, in essence. No President Biden, Trump retains power. And that's a classic example of what you would call an attempted coup, which is a form of insurrection or rebellion.
What about this argument that Donald Trump is not an officer of the United States? The president is not an officer of the United States, David. Colorado, in their brief arguing against Donald Trump's argument, says, no, absolutely, he was an officer. And they point to a Federalist paper written by I think it's James Madison. I got to check this. But they point to a Federalist paper where those words are used, that the president is an officer.
I think the argument that he's not an officer is extremely weak. And when you're reading the words on the page have their ordinary meaning unless the actual law itself changes that meaning in a specific way. And so if you're looking at it by every ordinary meaning of the word officer, Trump was an officer, and he would be again if he becomes president again. This is common sense reading of the text, and it's very, very strained to say, well, maybe he's an officer, but he wasn't under the United States, or he wouldn't be under the United States if he's president. Again, when you're reading laws, you read the words according to their ordinary, plain, normal meaning, unless the actual law at issue changes that meaning, and it doesn't here.
It's an Alexander Hamilton Federalist paper. I should be precise on this. And then the other question I have for you, David, is this idea that this is really Congress's authority. And the last question of the amendment as written, Section 3, is, but Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each House, remove such a disability. So they're laying out what qualifications you need to be president. They're saying you can't engage in insurrection. They've laid that out in the sentence before. The second sentence is, but Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each House, remove such a disability. How does that go with the argument that this is really Congress's purview?
Right. So what again, it's plain language. The actual prohibition is made effective by the passing of this amendment. This amendment makes that prohibition against an insurrectionist holding office effective. But then the amendment says plainly, Congress can act to remove the disability. It doesn't say that Congress has to act to impose the disability. The disability is there. It's in the Constitution now. But Congress may vote to remove it. That's the congressional action that is really relevant here. And Congress has not acted to remove that impediment from Donald Trump. If it wanted to, it could. If 2/3 wanted to, they could. But it hasn't. And therefore, the amendment is effective on its own terms.